The fishing dock in fog was draped in silence. Gray tendrils wrapped around wooden posts, muffling even the usual clatter of boat chains and nets. On this morning, an old fisherman named Hiro stood alone with his line cast into a sea barely visible beyond the mist. At his side, a younger man approached, Taro, who had left home years ago to find fortune in distant cities but now returned at dusk, drawn by familiar sounds and scents that drifted through foggy nights. He paused beside Hiro without speaking, feeling the cool dampness on his face. "Morning," said Hiro after several quiet minutes. "Morning," replied Taro, settling onto a nearby plank. The two men sat in companionable silence for a time, listening to the faint lapping of water against dock posts and distant cries of gulls that seemed to drift from another world. Hiro's line cast into nothingness moved occasionally, but no fish tugged at it this day. "Not catching much?" Taro finally asked. Hiro shrugged. "Sometimes the best catch is just being here." Taro nodded, absorbing the statement without comment, looking out over water that blurred everything beyond a few feet. Hiro watched him for a moment before reaching into his pocket and pulling out two old knives, plain steel blades worn by years of use. He handed one to Taro, who took it with both hands. "Thought you might need this," said Hiro. "For gutting fish, cleaning nets." Taro examined the blade in the muted light, running his fingers over its edge. "You think so?" Hiro smiled faintly. "Just figured a man should have good tools when he's back at sea." The fog began to lift slightly, allowing patches of blue sky to peek through, and Taro looked out again at waters now less obscured but still distant and dreamlike. "Thanks," he said quietly after several moments. He sheathed the knife slowly, carefully, tucking it into his belt beside him. "No need," Hiro responded. "Just a small gift." They sat for some time longer as lights spread over the water, casting soft shadows on docks and boats until everything seemed almost too bright to look at directly. Taro finally stood, glancing back at Hiro, who remained seated by the railing, staring outward where sea met sky in an endless horizon. "Maybe I'll come see you more often," said Taro. Hiro nodded without turning his head. "That'd be good." As Taro walked away, the fog started to clear entirely, revealing a crisp blue day with birds circling overhead and sunlight dancing on water surfaces. He paused one last time before disappearing into thinning mist, glancing back at Hiro, who still hadn't moved, but now looked more serene than ever. The sound of lapping waves against dock posts echoed through the morning air, mingling with distant gull calls and the soft rustle of wind and early leaves just awakening from winter's sleep.
You're listening to the Empty Teahouse. The dock creaked gently with the rising tide, carrying whispers of the morning's calm. Rain softened the earth in a quiet rice paddy as the harvest came to an end.
In the quiet rice paddy at the end of the harvest, Masao kneaded mud between his fingers. The stalks were cut and bundled, lying in rows across the field. Rain had softened the earth, leaving it slick underfoot. Beside him worked Akiko, who wore her hair in a bun held by a thin ribbon. Her hands moved efficiently through the muddy water. Masao glanced at Akiko's reflection in the shallow stream that meandered through the paddy. "Do you know why they call this the end of the harvest?" She paused to wipe sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, then resumed sorting out stray stalks from the earth. "They say it's when the land rests." "Rest?" Masao repeated softly, letting his own hands rest beside him. "The water's clearer here by the stream." Akiko looked at the ripples moving through the mud and pulled a clump of grass free from the soil. She bent to rinse her muddy hand in the cool current, watching as silt settled on the bottom. "You never used to talk this way," she said without accusation. He turned back to his work but didn't say anything for a while. When he spoke again, it was quieter than before. "I see things differently now." A breeze rustled the leftover stalks and Akiko's hair swayed gently around her face. She looked at Masao with an expression that softened as she continued washing her hands. What's different? Masao shrugged. More time. More to think about. He turned back to the task, but his movements were slower now. Akiko rinsed mud from her fingers and watched droplets slide down them like rain on a window pane. She held out one hand for Masao to see. It was pale where it had been tan. What's there to think about? She asked softly. He looked at the water rushing past, carrying bits of chaff with it downstream. The sound of the stream filled the air as Akiko turned back to her work without another word. Mud squelched beneath their feet and Masao felt a chill wind blowing in from the mountains beyond. I shouldn't be here, he said suddenly. I should have gone. Gone? She echoed, stopping again to face him. Masao looked at her with eyes that searched for something she might not find easy to give. Anywhere else? I never. His voice trailed off as he stared at the rushing water. Akiko's hand found his shoulder and squeezed gently. She held a handful of mud in the palm of her other hand, watching it slip through her fingers back into the stream. When she spoke again, it was to tell him what he already knew, what the paddy had shown them. It's not always where you go, Masao. Sometimes it's just knowing when to stop. The wind picked up and ruffled Akiko's hair as she let her muddy hand fall back into the current. The water carried a few stray stalks away from the edge of the field. Masao watched them go, feeling cold in his heart but warmer with each passing minute. She smiled faintly at him and returned to washing her hands in the gentle flow, letting each handful drift downriver. Come, she said quietly. We should finish. Masao nodded and picked up a stalk from the ground beside him. As they worked side by side, he noticed that Akiko's smile seemed just a little warmer than before. The sound of running water continued to fill their quiet world until it was all they could hear.
Water over stones grew louder as they walked away from the paddy. A riverbank at dusk where boats were pulled up for the night sat old Toshio with his tools beside him.
At dusk, on a riverbank where boats were pulled up for the night, there sat an old fisherman named Toshio. His weathered hands had lost much of their strength, but they still held onto his tools with practiced ease. The fishing nets lay in bundles beside him, drying from the day's work. A young man named Kenji approached and asked if he could help put away some gear. Toshio nodded silently. Kenji was new to this riverbank, fresh from college where he studied marine biology. He saw himself as a future guardian of these waters but knew little of practical fishing or the patience it required. As they worked in tandem, unrolling nets and stacking them neatly against stakes pounded into the ground, Kenji felt an odd calmness seep through him. After finishing, Toshio offered his apprentice some tea from a thermos hidden behind wooden crates stacked high with empty fish barrels. They drank slowly under the dim light of street lamps just beginning to flicker to life along the dock's perimeter. Each sip seemed to tie them closer together in shared quietude and effort. Toshio spoke first, pointing out how each knot held not only a net but also memories, some painful from loss, some joyful from abundant catches. Kenji listened intently, nodding when words failed him. When Toshio fell silent again, the young man began talking about his plans for the future, protecting fish species and educating others on sustainable fishing practices. Toshio looked at him steadily, then said quietly, "Nature changes faster than any plan." He paused, then added after a moment, "Fish don't read books." Night deepened around them. The air turned cool with mist rising from the river's surface like vapor wisps of thought. As they prepared to leave, Toshio handed Kenji an old wooden hook worn smooth by decades of use. "Keep this," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper in the growing night. "It may not seem important, but it is." Kenji took the hook gently, studying its lines and curves under the dim light. He felt Toshio's eyes on him for a long moment before the old man turned to walk towards home. The young man watched him go, the small object warm in his palm. A sudden gust stirred leaves from nearby trees, they swirled briefly before settling into dark heaps around feet planted firmly on ground. In the distance, a single gull cried out softly over water. As if responding, Kenji closed his fingers around the hook and slipped it carefully into his pocket where its weight settled reassuringly against his heart. The river flowed steadily onwards beneath thickening shadows, docks creaked gently in the breeze. Everything moved with a quiet certainty that spoke volumes about passing time and cycles unyielding yet comforting in their constancy.
Somewhere across the river, a dog barked into the dark. Late afternoon light dipped low over the horizon in an old village street, casting long shadows through narrow alleyways.
Late afternoon found Maiko sitting quietly behind her mother's weaver's shop. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows through the narrow alleyways of the village. She held a small piece of fabric in her hands, examining it closely. The work was good but imperfect, a stray thread out of place disrupting the pattern. A gentle knock sounded at the back door, and Maiko looked up to see an old man standing there with a weathered face and a walking stick. He seemed lost, eyes scanning around as if searching for something specific. Without speaking, he turned and began to walk away, only to pause and look back over his shoulder. Maiko stepped outside onto the porch. "Come in," she said softly. The man hesitated but then entered cautiously, eyeing her with a mix of fear and gratitude. She motioned for him to sit on an old stool by the door. "Did you need something?" Maiko asked gently. He shook his head and started to stand again, his hand clutching the walking stick tighter. "There's no rush," she said. "Why don't you rest a bit?" The man nodded silently and sat down once more, his eyes tracing over the colorful threads hanging from her mother's loom. Maiko busied herself with folding up a roll of woven cloth. Her fingers moved quickly, weaving in and out as if to mimic the rhythm of life itself. She glanced at him, noticed how his shoulders sagged under the weight of whatever burden he carried. Without thinking, she placed the neatly folded fabric on top of her lap. "You're welcome here," she said simply. "If you need anything, just say." He looked up from the floor, eyes wide with surprise and perhaps something else that Maiko couldn't quite name. For a moment neither spoke. The only sound was the distant murmur of village life settling into dusk. Maiko reached out slowly, pulling a thread loose near her knee. She held it out to him, offering both thread and hand in one gesture. "Let's fix this," she said softly. He took the thread carefully, his fingers brushing hers lightly as he accepted it. Together they worked quietly for several minutes, Maiko showing him how to reweave the broken strand back into the fabric of a larger whole. Outside, the sky darkened further, stars beginning to twinkle like tiny sparks in a vast night. The old man finished tying off his end and looked up at Maiko with an expression she couldn't decipher entirely. Tiredness perhaps, but also something more profound. "Thank you," he said quietly. Maiko smiled back, offering him her hand again as though to help him stand. This time when they touched fingers it was different. There was a spark between them that had not been there before. Outside the door a dog barked sharply, a reminder of distance and routine, but inside Maiko's home, there lingered a sense of shared quiet understanding. As he stepped out into the darkening alleyway, she watched him go. He paused briefly to look back at her in the doorway, then continued walking with a little more ease than before. The night closed around them both as if holding its breath. Maiko returned to her porch and sat down, the sound of rustling fabric and murmuring village life surrounding her like a soft embrace. She looked at her hands again, empty yet full, and felt something shift inside, subtle but unmistakable. Outside, the old man disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only his walking stick resting against Maiko's porch, a testament to one quiet moment in time.
The walking stick caught the last glow of twilight, then faded into shadow. A hillside terrace after a storm, rain leaving everything fresh and still.
A hillside terrace after a storm. Rain has left everything fresh and still. The air smells of wet earth and distant pine forests. Two people sit quietly on mismatched chairs in a small, unassuming tea house. One is an elderly woman with hands that tell stories of long days spent in fields and kitchens. Beside her sits a younger man, his eyes red from sleepless nights. The woman offers him a cup of steaming green tea. He takes it carefully, his fingers trembling slightly as he lifts the delicate porcelain to his lips. She watches him without saying anything, her face open but unreadable. After a few moments, he speaks softly, almost to himself, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do." She doesn't answer right away. Instead, she picks up her own cup and sips slowly, watching the wisps of steam rise into the cool air. The rain has left everything so quiet here on the hillside, the distant hum of traffic seems very far away. He continues after a while, his voice steady but strained, "I feel lost sometimes." She places her tea back down and reaches out to take one of his hands in hers, holding it gently between both of hers. They sit like that for a long time, neither speaking. The silence is not uncomfortable, there's an understanding in the stillness. Eventually, he lets go, drawing his hand away slowly as if waking from a dream. He meets her eyes briefly before looking back down at the table where two cups stand side by side. She speaks then, her voice soft but clear, "Sometimes we need to sit with what is." He nods slightly, something shifting in him that he can't quite name. A small bird chirps nearby, its song a sudden burst of life against the quiet morning. He smiles faintly, as if at some private joke only the birds can understand. She stands up then, picks up her purse from where she left it on a low table beside her chair. "I have to go," she says simply, but doesn't look away from him as she speaks. Her movements are slow and deliberate, each action considered before completion. He watches her leave without rising himself. She steps out onto the terrace into the soft light of the day, raindrops still clinging to her coat like tiny glass beads. He stays behind for a moment longer, sipping at his now cold tea, the taste no longer bitter but strangely comforting. Outside, she pauses and looks back over her shoulder, meeting his gaze once more from across the distance between them. Then she turns away again, walking down towards the road that winds its way through the village below. He stands too then, watching until she disappears around a bend in the path, leaving behind only the soft crunch of leaves beneath her shoes and the faint echo of a bird's call. He sets his cup carefully on the table beside him, listening to it clink softly against the empty space where hers had been moments before. The door swings gently open behind him as he steps out onto the terrace under the clear morning sky. He feels lighter somehow in that moment, the air is cool and fresh around him. He picks up a leaf from the ground, smooth and green, barely touched by the storm last night. As he lets it fall back to earth, one corner catching on a breeze and fluttering free again, he turns away to follow after her steps.
The cup still held a little warmth when he picked it up. Morning light crept over the hillside, softening the edges of yesterday's worries. We close the door now. Until tomorrow.